All right, welcome to this super awesome interview with Dr. Eric Helms on training volume. This interview is the final one from what I titled The Volume Month, which is just a series of interviews with the world's best experts on the same topic and getting different takes. So this one is with Eric Helms, and he will give you his interpretation of the research as well as his real-life experience on when and how it is appropriate to tinker with your training volume. You will get actionable and useful advice in this episode, as well as some interesting theoretical discussion. And if this sounds interesting to you and you're interested in episodes like this in the future, then I suggest, but of course it is only my suggestion, that you subscribe to this channel and turn on that bell notification icon so that you're up to date when content like this will come live on this channel, because there is certainly a lot of content like this here. I will also link the previous episodes of the Volume Month with Menno Henselmans, Mike Israetel, and James Steele in the description if you want to check those out. But anyway, with all of that said, let's get into this episode. How would you summarize why is training volume important in general?
Well, sure. I think the main reason training volume is important is because we live in a universe with time. It's just a way of quantifying how much work you're doing, and characterizing volume as the primary driver of hypertrophy, I think I can get behind, but I think it's important to understand that it's not something like distinct from the actual mechanism of progressive tension overload. Volume is just quantifying how much progressive tension overload you're supplying if all else is equal. And like almost every other adaptation in the body, if you create a specific adaptation for a specific outcome, like if you're doing muscular endurance training to get better at high repetitions, or if you're doing high volume running to get better at running for a marathon, or et cetera, to a point, the more that you do of the said task will get you a greater adaptation. So the specific task itself is basically the directionality of the adaptation. And then the volume that you do of that specific task that you're training is essentially the volume dial on how loud that adaptation will be, until you get to a point where you're doing so much that it is overwhelming your recuperative capacities, and you start getting a negative response. And so volume as it relates to hypertrophy is just the total amount of work you do. Probably the easiest way to count that is just the number of hard sets in at least a moderate rep range or higher. So we could say something like the 6 to 20 rep range. And there is a dose-response relationship with volume, or the number of sets you're doing, if we're using that quantification terminology, with the amount of hypertrophy you get. That's not a linear dose response, meaning that it's not a 1-to-1 of every set and you get 1 unit of muscle growth, but rather a diminishing returns response. So at a certain point, you get no return on investment, and at a point after that, you actually get a negative return on your investment as you're doing so much volume that you've actually overwhelmed your capacities to adapt maximally, so that you're adapting slower because you're doing so much, and eventually you can actually see no progress because you're just totally running yourself into the ground. So I think that's an important kind of way to look at volume globally.
Yeah. So one thing that I want to clarify for those listening is that if we look at just progression, or basically stressing the muscles more and more over time, and typically the way this happens in the real life, or maybe the most practical way of making this happen, is to just lifting heavier and heavier weights over time. So could we be saying that is, in a technical sense, the main driver of hypertrophy, and then volume is basically just dosing it out, and maybe it's just a matter of almost like modifying the rate at which this adaptation happens? So if you're dialing more of this stressor in, then maybe you're getting the adaptations a bit faster, and if you're dialing in a bit less, then you're just getting it a bit slower and over a longer time frame.
I would say yes and no. The actual act of adding weight to the bar is not necessarily what is causing progressive tension overload. I would say your ability to add weight to the bar is more close to the identification that progressive overload has occurred. If you are getting stronger, it means you've done something successful in your previous training. But the actual act of adding a little bit of weight to the bar is not necessarily what's making you get bigger over time, because you could just do more reps. with the same load and pushing yourself a little closer to failure. You could even drop the load and push it closer to failure and still provide a tension stimulus that's adequate to keep stimulating hypertrophy. For logistical reasons, you are eventually going to have to increase, the load on the bar for hypertrophy purposes, just because, if you think about, if you're someone who's listening and you've been lifting for a while, if you think about how much strength you gained in the first couple years, most of my lifts doubled over that period. So if I was to just add reps, I'd be doing an asinine amount of reps with very light weight that would eventually be suboptimal, or at least annoying and fatiguing to deal with. So you eventually do need to add weight to the bar. But that's certainly not the driver. The driver of hypertrophy is providing adequate stimulation to all the fibers, which can occur through adding more weight to the bar and probably will have to happen at a certain point. But the actual driver is enough effort with the sets you do at a high enough volume. And the point at which you can no longer add weight to the bar is indicative that the amount of volume you're currently doing is not enough for you to grow, assuming, nutrition's in the right place, recovery's in the right place, sleep's in the right place, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say it's not actually just the act of adding weight to the bar. It's providing a progressive tension stimulus, which can happen many ways. But eventually there may be a time when you have to just add total volume to make the stimulus enough.
Perfect. So, this 10 set mark was kind of the general recommendation that, you included, a lot of professionals gave out as of recent times, because that was the only real available data that we had on what's a good place to shoot for someone who is reasonably trained. So now that we had a bit more recent research coming out on higher training volumes, and perhaps we have a better idea as to what could be something to shoot for a trained guy. If some typical kind of intermediate guy who has been training for a couple of years, is not super advanced, but is definitely reasonably trained already, like what would be a good starting point where you would put them at this point based on the evidence we have?
I would still be having them starting around 10 sets per muscle group. I think that's a really good place to start. Right now, based on meta-analytic data, we have basically enough research to say with confidence that a good starting place is hitting each muscle group at least twice per week, performing at least 10 sets per muscle group per week, and then making sure that the sets you perform fall somewhere in the 6+ rep range, and then that they're a decently high effort level. If you do those three things, you've kind of covered the big picture bases that are appropriate for a starting point. There are going to be people who need or would respond best to less volume or more volume than that, of course, and you'll find that out through time and observation and paying attention. But the most recent research, there's actually very little research on volumes over 10 sets. I can think of maybe about 8 studies, and a fair amount of them are included in that meta-analytic data that I was talking about. Some aren't. But the majority show an issue, or at least a plateau of going over kind of the 10 to 20 set range. The meta-analysis where we got that 10 set figure, actually concluded it's 10 plus sets, because they simply didn't have enough data to meta-analyze really high volumes over 10 sets. And this is found in Ralston 2017 on strength. They kind of found like the 5 to 12 plus range, optimizing strength, as well as Schoenfeld also, that was fully published in 2017, 10 plus sets for hypertrophy. Now, if we kind of look at what studies that are available that have come out since then, we can see a point where you start to get less consistent progress from going higher than that. So for example, there was 2 studies done on German volume training, which is essentially a 10 set of 10 reps on certain exercises training protocol that was popularized back in the day. And they assessed a modified version of that compared to a 5-set protocol. And if you count the number of sets per muscle group in the same way that's done in the Schoenfeld meta-analysis, you see that the quote-unquote low-volume group is doing 9 to 18 sets per muscle group, while the high-volume group is doing 14 to 28 sets per muscle group. And in these 2 studies, one by, I'm going to mispronounce this, but I think it's Amirthalingam. I think that's an Indian last name. I could be wrong, but I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that and you're the author listening, as well as Hackett. Both studied this, and they found that the 14 to 28 set group either made no progress relative to baseline or actually regressed slightly. I believe in Hackett there was a decrease in leg lean mass in the group doing that high of sets. And the subjects in these studies weren't that well trained. They were benching like less than body weight, and they were required to have a minimum of 1 year of experience. And you compare that to some other studies where high volumes were effective, and you see a very different outcome, because at least my hypothesis is that the higher volumes, when they do work, they seem to be in individuals who are pretty damn well trained. So at least in these German volume training studies, 9 to 18 sets per muscle group was where the better gains were made, and you actually saw a negative outcome when doing close to twice that amount. In a recent study by Schoenfeld, they kind of had 3 groups. They had a 6 to 9 set per muscle group, 18 to 27 sets per muscle group, and then a 30 to 45 sets per muscle group group. And in this study, there was a dose response. The biggest differences were between the 6 to 9 and the 30 to 45 sets, but there were some trends towards the 30 to 45 sets per muscle group getting better hypertrophy than even the medium volume 18 to 27 sets per muscle group. So the question is, what's the difference? And if you look at the group differences in Schoenfeld versus those German volume training studies, you see that they're benching about 20 kilos more on average. They weigh a little more. And they're pretty reasonably well trained. I think about 4 years experience on average, and about like a 200-pound bench press in the Schoenfeld study. So I think that might indicate that higher volumes are probably only appropriate if you have a fair number of years under your belt. And the only other study where we've seen very high volumes be effective was in Riddell. I'm not sure how to pronounce this either. Riddell and colleagues. However, this was a study on Navy men, so 48 military men who were confined to a ship. So they've got, they're healthy, they're young, they have a background of calisthenics, and they've got consistent sleep schedules, eating schedules, and their life stress is going to be minimized because they're on a ship just on deployment. So in my opinion, I would say the data on high volume training indicates that if you can really dedicate your time to training and not much else, and your recovery is on point, or if you're well trained, it might go okay, at least in the short term. But we don't have studies any longer than 8 weeks up to 6 months.
Right. Now, speaking of this recent Schoenfeld study, I just want to dig into this a little bit because I think it's very interesting for a couple of reasons. The first thing that I would point out, and I'm super curious as to what you think of this, is that when I saw some of the details that were kind of emerging as I was reading through what they did, I was honestly kind of shocked that this actually produced positive results. Like, if I just think about doing 5 sets of squats with short rest periods, like I would think that by the 5th set, like you will be using some baby weight, like which is what we would kind of classify as like junk volume, like doing work, but is not really effective because it's way below what you would be capable of. But not only do they did that, but then they do like 5 sets of leg presses. Like I would even expect the first set of those to be kind of suboptimal, not very high quality work, but they did 5 sets and then 5 sets of leg extensions. Like if someone just asked me what I would predict would happen with someone if they did that, I would say they would atrophy, like no question. But not only that, but they actually made the best gains. So does it make you scratch your head a little bit? Because it certainly does it for me. So what do you think about this?
Well, I certainly wouldn't think someone would atrophy from doing 5 sets followed by 5 sets followed by 5 sets of squat, leg press, leg extension. I'd say there's really no evidence to support that conclusion. And yeah, I 100% agree that, resting, I think in this study, they rested 90 seconds between sets. I think that would make you drop the load off. You'd probably lose reps if you didn't drop the load. So just for everyone listening, you would have 90 seconds of rest between sets and then 2 minutes rest between exercises. That's definitely on the lower end of rest periods for that kind of volume and big compound movements. I would probably have someone resting, 2 minutes between sets as a minimum between sets of squats. And even then, you've got to be in pretty good condition. And I'm sure they were in pretty damn good condition after doing this, 3 times a week for 8 weeks, and they would acclimate to it. But certainly, I think you'd get better performance doing, 2 to 3 minutes of rest between sets and exercises. But yeah, I definitely don't think there's any evidence to suggest someone would atrophy from having to drop the load a little bit between sets. And most of the evidence we have where someone's approaching like 45 sets per muscle group on like quads, for example, is not that they would atrophy per se, but that they would plateau. The German volume training study does show that there was actually a decline in performance in the groups doing volumes approaching that amount. But then again, we have Redelier where they were doing 15 to 45 sets per muscle group in the highest volume group, and they actually saw the highest hypertrophy. So, there's a mixed group of data here. So yeah, most of the time we just see a plateau. Like there's a study by Ostrowski where the hypertrophy basically was slightly higher, but more or less plateaued once you reached about 14 sets for triceps. And then the highest group for quads was only 12 sets. So kind of showing again that right around past that 10 set mark is where things on average tend to plateau when you're looking at the research out there. So yeah, I think it's not an optimal setup, and studies almost never are. And then that's not their intention to provide an optimal hypertrophy program or strength program or anything. It's more just to test a hypothesis. So, you have established protocols for rest periods, sets, reps, days, and you match everything. And then you modify one variable. In this case, it was adding sets. And then you see what comes out of it. And it doesn't really surprise me that higher volumes. I mean, what I would have expected if I'd done the study and hypothesized what would have happened was that all three groups would have gotten bigger, but the moderate volume group probably would have gotten the biggest, and then it would have plateaued or gone down slightly. But I certainly would have predicted atrophy. I don't think that is supported by any prior research.
Yeah, to be fair, so my hypothesized outcome wouldn't have been that from all that stress, their muscles just collapse from all that stress and they just atrophy. I would have meant that over 8 weeks, they would have just performed so much sub-quality work chronically that over time, they simply would have been just understimulated effectively compared to what they could have stimulated themselves. So, yeah.
Gotcha. So just to make a point on that notch, so on that same point, well, if we think about it, if we compare 3 sets of leg press followed by 3 sets of three sets of squats followed by 3 sets of leg press followed by 3 sets of leg extensions to 5, the big difference is that we would get, the first set would be very high quality on both groups because they're not going into it fatigued on squats. And then each set would get successively lower quality, but you would still get more sets done in the 5-set group that are of higher quality, even if you get diminishing returns on each set. So, I mean, if it's just adding 2 more on top of what was already done. So I don't necessarily see why you would have to have more of the total volume be of such a low quality to get, that subpar results in the 5-set group compared to the 3-set group in my mind. That's just how I see it personally. I struggle to see how the 5-set group would actually do a lower total amount of quality work than the 3-set group. It would just be that, a greater proportion of their work would be lower quality, but because they're doing more total work in general and nearly doubling the other group's amount, that it's still more total high quality work, even if the proportion and the efficiency is lower. That said, I would still expect the middle group to grow the best, just because it seems to me that 30 to 45 sets per muscle group is just so much that recovery would be an issue, and it would be more of an issue of not the quality of work in the training session, but actually recovering between training sessions and overcoming the muscle damage to actually get to the growth process. But that's not always what happens in studies, what you hypothesize. So
yeah. The reason why this was surprising for me is because there was always this talk about quality versus quantity, and both are important. And I thought I would have hypothesized that once you get acutely fatigued within a session, beyond a certain point, additional work won't really provide extra stimulus unless you really have all the time in the world and you can rest a long time between sets and you can sufficiently recover at least to produce sufficiently high quality work in each additional set. But what this study seems to suggest then is that quantity counts so much that it can actually override the lack of quality. And I wouldn't have hypothesized that it would be such an extent. Maybe to a lesser extent, yes, but this is kind of an extreme setup. So just to clarify, that's my kind of surprise or where it's coming from.
No, I totally agree with you, Abel. I mean, and I don't think this changes the game. Like you, I think it just speaks to where that bell curve is. And in this study, it was shifted to the right a lot more than I think the authors hypothesized. Having spoken to James and Brad prior to when this study came out, they were both surprised about the results as well. Brad has been talking about a U-shaped curve and the dose response to hypertrophy for a long time. You can see that in his textbooks and in the publications that I've done with him back in 2014, when we wrote our recommendations for bodybuilding training. He added a part where, there's probably a dose response curve to hypertrophy, which has been illustrated in some other research. And I think it still would be illustrated in this group. It might just be that it would have occurred even a higher volume, which is just surprising. But I think it's also really important just to recognize that no one study should dictate what you do in the gym. And right now, we have the 2 German volume studies. We have Ostrowski, and we have a number of other studies. Baker, that I can think of, that was on strength, not hypertrophy, but nonetheless. And let's see, there's another study I can think of where lower volume beat out higher volume. Gonzalez-Padillo was on strength as well. And there might even be one other, which I'm just blanking on right now, but I can think of probably 5 or 6 studies where a lower volume group either made better gains or the same gains as a group that was driving its volume up into kind of the over 20 set range or over 10 set range. So I think it would be a mistake to just read this study and go right into doing 30 sets per muscle group. The study is also only 8 weeks long. And it doesn't necessarily measure, it doesn't tell you in a year of training like this who gets injured the most, or is this even sustainable, or what kind of aches and pains do you have, or anything like that. So, and I think the authors did a really good job of pointing out that the strength and muscular endurance outcomes were the same between groups, at least statistically, and that you can get robust endurance and strength adaptations from just 13 minutes of training 3 times per week. So it totally depends on your goal. I think it's important to recognize that hypertrophy is kind of the side effect of doing enough work at an adequate effort. And for people who are trying to get as strong as possible or just improve their fitness, you can do way less than this and get robust adaptations.
Right. Now, another thing that I would be curious about, okay, like you said, one thing that we conclude from a study like this is that at least for 8 weeks, doing an extremely high volume of work can work out for us. Now, how do you think this can be extrapolated into some general practice, or if someone wants to take something away for their general training setup, like what is something that could be implemented in practice based on this study?
Well, not a whole hell of a lot, but because you would need a lot of confidence that you're not going to have the response that was seen in like these 5 or 6 other studies where you'd actually get no more growth or even less growth. But I would say that we know that for 8 weeks, in some studies, especially in studies that have the higher trained individuals, the dose response of volume and hypertrophy is higher than we previously thought, but not always. The question then becomes, how is this useful to us? Well, for one, it can just tell us that we can look at volume differently and have maybe a different sliding scale on what's appropriate. But I think more importantly are some other things that have been pointed out by like James Krieger in his blog and in his presentation at a conference I was recently at, in that, and if you look at the individual data points in his blog, you can see that there was no non-responders in the high volume group. And this is interesting because in previous research on endurance training, we've seen that the non-responder phenomenon is actually fixed, quote unquote, by just having them do more endurance training. So to get a VO2 max adaptation and improve your fitness, if you're a quote unquote non-responder to endurance training, it actually just means you have to do more to get a more or less normal response to training, which is unfortunate. And, not everyone wants to just go out and pound the pavement even more just to try to get some endurance adaptations, but it may be that the same thing is true, at least for hypertrophy. So it tells us that one option on the table is that if you are struggling and you're a quote unquote hard gainer, maybe doing more volume. However, where I would really caution someone is how they do that additional volume and in what order of possible solutions they put it. And I think it should be like last on the list. I think the first thing is you should assess, am I getting 8+ hours of sleep per night? Am I managing my life stress balance well? Am I ensuring that I'm in a small surplus and eating adequate amounts of protein, and I'm not too high or too low in either carbs or fat, and that I have really good technique on all of my lifts, and that each one of my sets is taken to an adequate effort level. Like if someone was to objectively observe me, they'd say that, I'm not leaving more than 3 or 4 reps in the tank on a regular basis. Likewise, that I'm not taking every single set to absolute gut-wrenching failure. So to make sure that all those other things are in place before deciding to then turn up the volume dial, I think is really important. And then, like I said, how you do it is also very important. And one thing that has been speculated about for a long time is that if you want to try to really push the volume up as a advanced lifter, it's probably not feasible to do so for A, a long period of time, or B, to do it on every single muscle group at the same time. And since we know that you can make progress on less sets, indeed, all 3 groups in this study made hypertrophy progress, you can drop your volume on most of your muscle groups down to somewhere closer to that 10 set mark, while then taking 1 or 2 muscle groups up in volume, but still proportionate to where you have been. So if you've been doing 15 sets, I wouldn't go to 30. I would probably, drop your all your muscle groups down to 10 that you weren't specializing on, and then maybe take 2 muscle groups to 20 sets per week for a couple mesocycles to see if you can progress on them. I think it's really important to make increases in volume only when you are plateaued and everything else is in order, and in some reasonable proportion to the current volume you're doing, not based on what some study did. If you've been training with 12 sets per muscle group and you've been plateaued and all those other things I mentioned are in order, you wouldn't read the study and go, right, let me just, multiply my volume by 4 and go to 48 sets per muscle group because that's close to the high volume group. You would try maybe doing 14 or 15 sets, making like a 20 or 30% increase at most, in my opinion.
Right. And this is very interesting what you just mentioned, because while I personally don't know a lot of people who would say that they are non-responders, but I certainly know a lot of people who are just chronically kind of dissatisfied with their results. And even if they are making some progress, so let's say someone is doing 12 sets of work a week, like you just mentioned, and they are making some gains, but there is always the possibility that they could even be making better gains, right? So kind of what would you say to these people who are tempted, not necessarily just by these studies, but just by the idea when they find out that volume is a key driver for hypertrophy? And it's always easy, right? Like volume and adding in more sets is always something that you can just modify, and it's fully under your control, unlike adding load to the bar, which is only going to happen as fast as it's going to happen. So what are some things that they should keep in mind? So you mentioned recovery. Are they sleeping enough? Are they eating enough? But what is something that should definitely make someone think twice before they add in a whole bunch of extra sets to make even better progress?
Great question, Abel. And I think, if you've been in the gym for a decent amount of time, we're talking, more than a couple of years, and you are still making progress, you're probably doing a lot more right than you realize, at least as far as those big rocks. And the grass is probably not that much greener anywhere. If you're a drug-free lifter who's been in the game more than 2 years and you are progressing, I would say hold tight, unless you write down how many sets per muscle group you're doing, and it's significantly less than 10, which I think is a decent starting point, because that meta-analysis was based largely on untrained or recreationally trained individuals, and it's the average. So if you're doing less than 8 sets per muscle group and you are feeling fine and you are progressing, but it does seem slow, I think there's nothing wrong with, making a bump up to 10 sets and just seeing how you do, assuming all those other things are in order like you and I just mentioned. But if you're already doing, 10 sets or more, and you're progressing and you've been in the gym a couple years, I would just caution you that from my years of coaching experience, the grass is almost certainly not greener on the other side, and you may end up just doing a lot of volume without actually seeing much return on that investment. And there's something to be said for for realizing that you're no longer a newbie. You're no longer even necessarily an early stage intermediate if you've been progressing for the entire time you've been training. And if you just think about it logically, you can't make those newbie gains anymore. I mean, if you could, like I said, I doubled my strength on squat, bench, and deadlift in the first 1 to 2 years I trained. If I could do that every 2 years, I would be stronger than Ray Williams on my squat and benching similar numbers to that as well. It's not possible. So, you have to understand that your rate of progress will slow the stronger you get and the bigger you get. And, as you kind of reach that genetic ceiling, you're going to always be moving, at a slightly slower pace to get closer to it. And if you are experienced and you're an experienced lifter, and you're progressing at all, and you can track that and visually observe that, objectively, then you probably shouldn't change things too much because you've got that recipe correct. It would be my advice to someone.
Yeah, absolutely. And just hypothetically, like one thing that these high volume studies made me curious about, and I think this is, we can actually ignore the studies for a second and just, I think any given lifter can probably progress on a range of volumes. Probably if they err way on the side of the lower volume end, then they will progress a little bit slower. But probably you can get into that territory when you're not really progressing any faster, but you're just getting a bit more niggles. So like how much do you think that's sliding up and down on that scale is going to make a difference in the long run? So let's say I can progress anywhere between 10 and 20 sets. Is it like how much faster of progress will I make if I'm trying to squeeze out the maximum amount of volume that I possibly can do, as opposed to just picking something that is going to kind of smooth sail me all the way to the end? If this question makes any sense.
That's a great question, Abel. No, that's actually being able to quantify like how much faster are you going to be gaining. And I actually won't put the studies aside quite yet, because one cool thing about meta-analyses we have is they work around effect size statistics, which allows you to look at different percentage changes and calculate that. And if I recall correctly, and I'm close, I'm not getting the number perfectly, but I think I'm pretty close, is that in the Schoenfeld meta-analysis on hypertrophy, the 1 to 5 set group per week, or that category, I should say, in the meta-analysis was gaining hypertrophy at about half the rate of the group that is, no, that's not right. So the 10 plus group, if I recall correctly, was gaining 50% more muscle mass per unit of time than the group doing 1 to 5 sets. So 50% better gains over time. Now, when we're talking about going above 10 sets, on average, you think it's going to be less than that. We're seeing diminishing returns. So, let's say we're talking about a range of 10 to 20 sets, which I think is a very reasonable range to train in. Assuming that you actually are going to get a positive response from 20 versus 10 sets, which I think is probably unlikely just on average, but some people that might be the case, it's going to be a much smaller amount. It certainly won't be twice. You could double your volume for maybe a 10% increase in gains, and twice the number of exposures to training, which is twice the number of exposures to potential injury. And like you said, potentially many more niggles and stress from that. So you have to ask yourself, am I putting myself in a tortoise versus the hare position where I might be making faster progress for the next couple months, but I'm, cruising for an injury that might put me out for a month as well, and that I would have just gotten passed up by myself in another dimension where I was doing 10 sets. You can't know this, but you also have to look at this kind of like a gambler. Like, what do you stand to benefit from doing a very high volume program, and what do you stand to lose, and what makes the most sense? Like, if you're currently making progress on 10 sets per muscle group and you go, you know what, let me just double that and go to 20 sets, what do you stand to gain? Objectively, probably no more than like a 10% increase in your rate of progress, which you won't even be able to really see. What you stand to lose, though, is a potential injury. So I do think people should err on the side of being conservative once they're in the range of what we think is reasonable. And like you said, you may just be, trading more time in the gym for being a little more uncomfortable in your hip flexor or your IT band or your shoulder without actually any additional gains in many cases.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and it's the 10% mark that you just mentioned. I mean, I think that's an even better way of putting it into perspective to people. Earlier, like I was trying to illustrate it to someone, and I was, just for the sake of making it a little bit more kind of optimistic, I just used a 50% mark. So let's say you go from 10 sets to 20 sets and you will be making 50% faster gains. That would mean that you will put on X pounds of muscle in 12 months as opposed to 18 months. And if you look at it that way, it's not that big of a gain, but 10%, I mean, that's even more, makes it even more trivial. So it's funny. So I guess, like one of my last questions to you is, and I know, I fully understand that you don't like to share these personal numbers, and I personally don't like to talk about these things either. But just to like give people some ideas, you're an advanced lifter, and you have been methodical and meticulous about your training. You observe how your body responds to things, and you're intimately familiar with the latest scientific literature. So, like, how much, if you look at these numbers and these volume landmarks, as Mike Israetel would call it, like how far did you have to ever climb up these ladders for the sake of hypertrophy, personally?
Great question. And I'm actually very comfortable sharing this because I think we've done a really good job of providing all the caveats and discussing how, the average response in a study is not how an individual should be, planning their own training. And recently, since James presented some of this data at the conference in Melbourne back a couple months ago, I played with basically some specialization cycles on my own, where I was doing what we talked about, jumping up the volume on one or two muscle groups at a time. I actually did a 2-week specialization on quad and glutes, and then hams and glutes, and then calves for the lower body, while I was doing chest and back, or rather push and then pull and then arms for the upper body. So I had kind of this upper lower specialization cycle for a while, and I was pushing my volume up into, say, the 20 to 25 sets per muscle group on the body part that I was specializing, and keeping it closer to 10 on the muscle groups where I wasn't trying to specialize on them. And that was more just of a logistical kind of experiment, because I don't really expect to see a huge amount of progress in 6 weeks. But in looking at more global numbers that I've played with over time, and when I've broken plateaus, I got to like a 315-ish bench, and it was stuck there for years, and subsequently didn't have much upper body development change until I really started playing with higher frequency and higher volume with my upper body. So I personally have pushed my sets on chest and like my upper body in general up to like the 15 to 25 mark to see progress. And I've done closer to the 20 to 25 mark for my upper body for years now, and that has been what I've needed to do to see more or less consistent progress. For my lower body, I don't seem to need as much volume, which kind of ironically is the opposite of what some studies show. But that's typically more close to that like 10 to 20 versus that 15 to 25 set range for my upper versus my lower body, where I've needed to keep progressing. So that's kind of where I've been. And so I find that is best done when I'm doing 4 to 6 days per week and focusing on upper, lower, and full body days kind of intermingled together as a way to hit everything.
Yeah, and just, I mean, not to open up a whole other can of worms, but when you talk about these higher volume numbers, so 15 to 25, like 25 is a fair amount of volume, like how many training days do you like to distribute that? Because there is also a fair amount of intelligent debate, or at least discussion over kind of the diminishing returns effect of volume within any given session. So like what's the most amount of work that you like to perform for any given muscle group within a single session?
Great question. Yeah. So when I was trying to push my bench press and make some progress on that, and when I was successful, I was benching every time I came in the gym, and that was 5 to 6 days per week, and I was doing 3 to 4 sets per bench session. So that was only three to four sets for those muscle groups per day. And I wasn't doing any, at least pushing accessory work. I was doing, I should say any horizontal pushing accessory work. I was still doing overhead press once to twice per week, and then, training my arms directly, once or twice a week as well. But to kind of put those on a more minimalist approach, just one overhead press session, one tricep session, and then benching, 5 to 6 days. And so that limits the total volume and all those target muscle groups a good bit. And then in general, if I'm on a more balanced, higher volume approach for a muscle group, I'm probably not going to do any more than like 6 to 9 sets for a target muscle group in a session. And then if I need to get more, then I just got to do more sessions. So for example, if someone was going to specialize on training their back, they might do like a row, a lat pull down, and then like a pullover or like a high row, like a face pull or something like that. 3 sets a piece at most in one session. And then if they want to get, into those higher volumes, they're just going to need to hit it three more times or something like that per week. Or sneak another exercise in on a leg day. I think that's a really useful way of doing it, is just tack on additional volume on a day that's not traditionally dedicated toward that muscle group.
Awesome. Perfect. That's fair enough. Well, Eric, I think I asked you all my questions. So thank you so much for taking the time. And so maybe just mention where people can find your work and where people can see what you're up to.
Well, Abel, I always appreciate this, man. It's always good to talk to you. And thank you for the opportunity to be on here. So just first want to say that. And if anyone's interested in finding my work, I analyze a lot of studies actually with my colleagues Greg Knuckles and Dr. Mike Zerdos at MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. And you can find that at strongerbyscience.com/mass. And then if you want to read my books where I go into training and nutrition, we're actually updating them for the 2nd edition by the end of the year. You can check us out at muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. And then for stuff related to natural bodybuilding and powerlifting, you can check out 3dmusclejourney.com. And then to get a little kind of flavor on what my life's like and the stuff that I'm personally interested in, make sure to follow me on Instagram at Helms3DMJ.
Awesome. Perfect. Eric, thank you so much for taking the time. It was an absolute pleasure.
Two-way street, brother.
All right, well, that was our episode today with Dr. Eric Helms. Did you like it? Did you not like it? What did you think anyway? Let me know in the comment section. And of course, feel free to check out the previous episodes of the Volume Month 2, linked in the description. And if you haven't already, definitely hit that subscribe button and that bell notification icon so that you're up to date on future episodes like this one, which will definitely come. So that will be it for today. And with that, see you next time.